Welcome to today's deep dive. I am so glad you are here with us. We have a really fascinating mission today. We are taking a hefty stack of primary source notes, historical accounts, and deep dive analyses to try and distill a massive, yet honestly entirely overlooked historical event.
It really is.
We're looking at a battle that historians have dubbed Austria-Hungary's Stalingrad.
It is a phenomenal topic to dig into. It is one of those moments in history where the sheer scale of the event almost defies comprehension. When we talk about the Eastern Front of the First World War, the narrative usually gets swallowed up by the Western Front's trench warfare, you know?
Right, exactly.
But the scale of what happened here was just unprecedented.
It was. And our hook for you today is the Siege of Przemyśl. For those studying the Eastern Front, you already know, this fortress town on the River San was the linchpin of the region. This was the longest siege in Europe during the entirety of the First World War.
The longest one.
Yeah. And in fact, it was the second largest siege in the entire global conflict, sitting only behind the Siege of Medina. So, set the scene for us. Where exactly are we in the strategic timeline of 1914?
Let's wind the clock back to August of 1914. The guns of August have just fired, the war has kicked off, and the Russian armies are advancing. They launched these massive offensives against both German East Prussia and Galicia.
Okay.
Now the Russian advance into Germany gets famously halted at Tannenberg, but their Galician campaign. The Russian general Nikolai Ivanov completely overwhelms the Austro-Hungarian forces. This forces the entire Habsburg front to collapse and fall back over 160 kilometers, retreating all the way back to the Carpathian Mountains.
So the entire line just buckles.
Exactly, the whole thing. But there was one massive fortified exception left behind. By September 28, 1914, the fortress at Futile is the solitary Austro-Hungarian post still holding out. It is completely surrounded, stranded deep behind Russian lines.
Which brings us to the strategic stakes for you, the listener. Why does this specific fortress matter so much to both empires?
Because Przemyśl was geographically the shield protecting the vital German industrial region of Silesia.
The industry.
Right. If the Russians bypass or capture Przemyśl, they are in a prime position to pour through the gap and directly threaten the industrial heart of the German war machine. That made holding this fortress an absolute top priority for the Austro-Hungarians, and by extension, their German allies.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because the Russians couldn't just bypass it and they couldn't just walk in. When looking through our sources on the engineering here, the numbers are almost surreal.
They really are. The Austro-Hungarians had spent decades turning the city into a modern military behemoth. We are looking at 50 kilometers of reinforced trenches dug into the earth, fortified by heavy artillery and concrete redoubts.
And the barbed wire, our notes mentioned 1,000 kilometers of barbed wire?
Yes. 1,000 kilometers. They used that wire to construct 7 distinct massive lines of defense, completely circling the perimeter of the town. The logistics of just manning that perimeter required a staggering amount of manpower.
Just to stand on the line.
Exactly. Inside this ring, you had a military garrison of 127,000 troops alongside 18,000 civilians. And sitting right outside those 7 defense lines, 6 entire Russian divisions waiting for the order to move.
But the garrison itself wasn't just a unified block of soldiers, was it? The internal makeup of the fortress seems like a complete logistical nightmare.
What's fascinating here is how the fortress of Przemyśl perfectly reflected the incredibly fractured nature of the Austro-Hungarian Empire itself. It was an absolute Tower of Babel.
A Tower of Babel.
Because the Habsburg Empire was so vast and multi-ethnic, the daily military orders in the fortress had to be issued in 15 different languages just to be understood by the rank and file.
15 languages just to issue basic daily orders. That level of friction in the chain of command must have been paralyzing.
Paralyzing and highly combustible. You had Austrians, Hungarians, Poles, Jews, and Ruthenians all crammed together. Under normal peacetime conditions, the empire struggled to manage these ethnic tensions. Now imagine putting all of those different language groups carrying all their historical grievances into a besieged cage while artillery shells rain down on them.
Which brings us to September 24th, 1914, and the start of the first siege. The Russian Third Army has the city surrounded. But their commander, General Radko Dmitriev, decides he doesn't want to wait around for a protracted siege.
Dmitriev makes a remarkably arrogant and ultimately fatal tactical decision. Despite lacking sufficient heavy siege artillery, he orders a brief, largely ineffective bombardment, and then sends his infantry in for a full-scale brute force frontal assault. He attacks the fortress commander Hermann Kuzminec von Bringerstetten head-on.
But wait, if he doesn't have the heavy artillery to cut the wire or smash the concrete redoubts, He's just sending infantry into 1,000 kilometers of unbroken barbed wire.
Yeah.
That seems incredibly reckless, even by the standards of 1914.
It was reckless, but it was symptomatic of early World War I military doctrine. Many commanders were still trying to fight a 19th century war of movement, an elan against 20th century industrialized defenses. Dmitriev throws his men at those 7 lines of defense for 3 consecutive days.
Just wave after wave.
The result is absolute slaughter. The Russians accomplish absolutely nothing strategically, but the cost is staggering. 40,000 Russian casualties in just those 3 days.
40,000 casualties just to hit a brick wall.
Mm.
But while Dmitriev is bleeding his army dry against the wire, the Austro-Hungarians aren't just sitting idle in the mountains, are they?
No, the Austro-Hungarian High Command recognizes the urgency. A relief force led by Svetozar Borovich von Bojna launches a counteroffensive and advances toward the fortress. With this relief force bearing down on their rear, the Russians are forced to call off the assaults by early October.
They actually retreat.
They do. Between October 9th and 12th, Borovich's forces actually break through the Russian lines and enter the besieged fortress.
I have to imagine that was a massive morale boost for the garrison. They probably thought the worst was behind them. The Russian army had been repelled, and the siege was totally over. Time to go home.
It was celebrated as a monumental triumph. But the reality was that the strategic situation across the broader Eastern Front was deteriorating rapidly for the Central Powers. The relief was incredibly short-lived. By the end of October, Paul von Hindenburg's German forces suffer reversals at the Battle of the Vistula River, forcing the Austro-Hungarian armies to retreat westward again to maintain the line.
Leaving Przemyśl exposed all over again.
Exactly. On November 4th, the military command orders civilians to leave Przemyśl if they can, recognizing what is about to happen. And just a few days later, on November 10th, the Russian army returns. The trap snaps shut once more, and the second siege begins.
But Dmitriev's failure totally shifts the Russian playbook, doesn't it? Here's where it gets really interesting, because the Russians bring in a new commander for the 11th Army General Andrei Selivanov, and he has a completely different philosophy on how to take this city.
Selivanov looks at the 40,000 Russian bodies left on the wire from the first siege and immediately bans any further frontal assaults. His strategy is chillingly modern and pragmatic. He's going to starve the garrison into submission.
Just wait them out.
He establishes a tight blockade, sits his army out of range of the fortress guns, and waits. By mid-December, as winter sets in, he brings up his heavy artillery and starts pounding the fortress, continuously letting hunger and high explosives do the work that his infantry couldn't.
It's a terrifying waiting game. But while Selivanov is starving the city, the real horror of this campaign wasn't just happening inside the fortress walls. The sources point to an absolute catastrophe happening in the mountains to the south.
You are referring to the Carpathian Winter War. While the garrison slowly starved, the Austro-Hungarian Chief of Staff Konrad von Hertzendorf became obsessed with relieving Przemyśl. During the brutal winter of 1914 to 1915, he ordered his armies to fight their way through the frozen passes of the Carpathian Mountains.
But launching a mountain offensive in the dead of winter, the logistical requirements for that must have been impossible for the Austro-Hungarian military at that stage.
It was a logistical nightmare that bordered on criminal negligence. We are talking about poorly supplied, outgunned imperial forces, many in summer uniforms, ordered to launch offensive after offensive into freezing mountain passes covered in meters of snow. Train lines froze, supply lines broke down entirely, and men were freezing to death in their sleep.
That is just bleak.
The official casualties reported for these relief efforts between January and April 1915 were a mind-boggling 800,000 men.
800,000 casualties. And most of those weren't even from Russian bullets, were they?
No. The vast majority of those losses were from frostbite avalanches, exposure, and disease. Nature was a far deadlier enemy than the Russian army in those mountains. Entire regiments were swallowed by the snow. And despite that unimaginable sacrifice, the Habsburg forces completely failed to break through to the garrison.
To really grasp the gravity of this deep dive, I think we have to zoom back into the fortress itself. While 800,000 men are freezing in the mountains, what is the day-to-day reality for the 145,000 people trapped inside the wire?
The primary sources are invaluable here. The surviving diaries and notebooks give us an unvarnished look at a society collapsing under pressure. One of the most striking accounts comes from the diary of Joseph Thoman, an Austrian who was conscripted as a junior military doctor.
Tolman's diary is incredibly dark. We often have this romanticized, noble view of the imperial officer class in early World War I, but Tolman's account completely shatters that.
It does. Toman documented the horrific behavior of the garrison officers as the situation deteriorated. He wrote extensively about how the military hospitals were recruiting local teenage girls to work as nurses. The incentive was 120 crowns a month and crucially free daily meals. In a starving city, that was an offer families couldn't refuse.
But Tolman noted they weren't primarily being used as nurses at all. He documented that they were being exploited to satisfy the officers and even the senior medical staff.
Correct. Toman's diary is filled with disgust. He noted how these senior officers were coming into his clinics almost daily with horrific venereal diseases like syphilis, gonorrhea, soft chancre. He wrote with visceral anger about how these young girls were being manipulated by these pestilent pigs in their spotless uniforms. It paints a picture of intense moral decay at the top of the command structure while the rank and file were eating their horses to survive.
And that moral decay wasn't just limited to the military command. The societal cracks among the civilians were widening rapidly too. We see this clearly in the diary of Helena Jablonska, a wealthy Polish civilian living in the town.
Jablonska's diary is a direct window into the extreme class and ethnic resentments of the era. As food became scarce and inflation skyrocketed, she wrote with intense bitterness. Now, as we look at her primary source text, we must be objective and note that her entries are heavily steeped in the anti-Semitism of the time, documenting how the Jewish population became the primary scapegoat for the starvation.
She writes about Jewish women in the basements, supposedly ripping people off, and notes that as the siege neared its end in March 1915, Jewish shop owners were desperately hurrying to take their signs down so the invading army couldn't tell who owned what.
Exactly. It shows how starvation accelerates existing societal fractures. The civilian population was turning on itself. And Jablonska's observation about the shop signs was incredibly prescient because it sets the stage for a horrific climax. When the Imperial Russian Army finally does capture the city, the Tsarist soldiers, specifically the Cossack units, unleash a violent pogrom against the Jewish population.
The accounts of that capture are brutal. Just plain brutal.
Jablonska recorded that the Cossacks intentionally waited until the Jewish population set off to the synagogue for their prayers. Once they were gathered, the soldiers attacked them with whips in the streets. She described the lamenting and despair, noting that people tried to hide in cellars, but she knew the soldiers would hunt them down there too. It's a stark reminder that in these grand military sieges, the civilian populations, particularly marginalized communities, absorb the most catastrophic consequences.
It is incredibly heavy history. But looking through the source material, there's a logistical detail that stands out as a bizarre contrast to all this suffering on the ground. When you have an entire city cut off from the world for months, how did they communicate with the high command in Vienna?
The answer involves some of the earliest, most ingenious methods of military aviation.
They used airmail. Think about the primitive state of aviation in 1914 and 1915. You have these flimsy biplanes flying out of a besieged, starving city right over the Russian artillery lines. Our sources note there were 27 separate airmail flights out of Przemyśl during the sieges.
It was incredibly dangerous work, and it wasn't always successful. The records detail one specific flight that suffered engine trouble and was forced to land behind Russian lines. The Russians captured the pilots, confiscated the bags of mail, and incredibly, instead of just destroying it, they shipped the entire haul all the way to St. Petersburg just so it could be officially processed by Tsarist postal censors before onward transmission.
The sheer bureaucracy of sending starving soldiers' mail to St. Petersburg to be censored is mind-boggling. And when the planes couldn't fly, they resorted to even older methods. Manned paper balloons, unmanned balloons carrying bundles of letters, and even pigeon mail. It creates this surreal, almost cinematic image of paper balloons floating up from this freezing, bombarded hellscape, hoping the wind carries them over the Russian lines.
It highlights the desperation of the garrison. But by early spring, no amount of ingenuity or communication could change the reality on the ground.
Right. Let's narrate the end of the line. By late February of 1915, it becomes crystal clear that Konrad von Hötzendorf's massive relief efforts in the Carpathians have entirely failed. The Austro-Hungarian High Command essentially radios Commander Kuzmanek and tells him you are on your own. Meanwhile, General Sullivan finally gets his shipment of heavy siege artillery, and the Russians just start systematically dismantling the concrete defenses.
By March 13th, the Russians finally breached the northern defense lines. Kuzmanek knows the situation is completely untenable. He orders his men to hold an improvised inner line just long enough to destroy anything in the city that could be useful to the Russian war machine. They blow up the bridges, the remaining artillery, and the munitions dumps.
And then he attempts one final breakout on March 19th.
He does. He attempts a desperate sally to break through the Russian encirclement, but his troops are severely malnourished, exhausted, and outgunned. They are easily repulsed and forced back into the rubble of the fortress.
With literally no options left, the white flag goes up. On March 22nd, 1915, the surrender takes place. And the sheer number of prisoners the Russians take is astounding. We are talking about 117,000 Austro-Hungarian troops marching into captivity.
The officer count alone was staggering. The Russians captured 9 generals, 93 senior staff officers, and over 2,500 junior officers. Notably among the captured was the famous Hungarian war poet Géza, who ultimately died in a Russian prisoner of war camp.
If we connect this massive surrender to the bigger picture, what does this do to the Austro-Hungarian Empire?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the macro results were absolutely devastating. Remember, this fortress was originally designed to hold a garrison of maybe 50,000 men, yet when it fell over, 110,000 surrendered. When you combine that capture with the 800,000 men lost in the Carpathian relief efforts, the Habsburg military apparatus suffered over 1 million casualties just for this one city.
1 million casualties. That is a structural blow you don't recover from.
And they didn't. The Habsburg army was effectively hollowed out. From that moment forward in 1915, Austria-Hungary ceased to be an independent military power. They were forced to rely entirely on German assistance, German troops, German commanders, German logistics to prop up their lines for the rest of the war. Pigeon broke their independence.
So what does this all mean? We started with a single fortress in Galicia that managed to tie down massive Russian armies for months. It triggered a catastrophic winter relief effort that resulted in 1 million casualties, largely to frostbite and disease. And ultimately, its fall shackled the Austro-Hungarian military to Germany for the duration of the war.
It was a profound strategic pivot point, but I want to leave you with a different angle to mull over, looking at the very nature of the fortress itself. We have talked extensively about how this siege broke the Austro-Hungarian army, but consider the internal dynamics. The fortress of Pigeon required daily military orders to be translated into 15 different languages just to function.
Just to get by day to day.
Exactly. When we look at the mutual distrust, the ethnic tensions, the sheer logistical impossibility of keeping that garrison united under pressure, we have to ask a broader question. Was the fall of Przemyśl truly a military defeat caused by Russian starvation tactics? Or was this fortress simply a microcosm of the Austro-Hungarian Empire itself, a fractured entity that was always destined to collapse from the inside out the moment it was put under severe siege?
That is a phenomenal point to end on. A fortress that mirrors the fatal flaws of the empire that built it. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the source material. We hope it gave you a new lens through which to view a monumental piece of history. Keep questioning the consensus, keep digging into the primary sources, and above all, stay insanely curious. We will catch you in the next deep dive.